It's 6 o'clock on the shortest day of the year. I always love this day, even though it takes about 5 or 6 days before we start to really see any changes in the timing. But always the 21st of December is what I look forward to. And consequently, in the middle of the spring or in June 21st, and the days start getting shorter, I get summarily depressed over that, but not too impressed. Anyway, as many of you have watched over the last couple of months, this is a little different format than the tequila time with Art. Number one is I'm drinking watermelon water right now, out of a can, I should say. We first talked for the first 5 minutes of this program about something that we've gleaned from the news service over the last 4 weeks. And we found something that we'd like to talk about. Then there's a 4-minute video. I'm here with the gentleman that made this video, Kyle Jones. Is it about 4 minutes?
Yeah, it's about 4.5, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. And then I talk about some of the photos from the shoot around that video. So that's kind of our program, and this should start and end in 1/2 hour, because I know that, well, I like to believe that everybody is about my work, but I came to realize that you also have lives. So anyway, my program begins with this. On the 14th of December, a John Waterman, who was a park ranger up in Alaska, 40 years ago, he floated the Noatak River. And this past year, he went up there with his son, trying to relive great memories. And what he found was a very different environment in the Arctic, Alaskan Arctic. What he talks about is just treks across the tundra, which would have been permafrost and easy to negotiate, now is a quagmire of mud. Quite honestly, all of the Arctic lands around the world are changing, and it's changing twice as fast as the lower latitudes. So 90 degrees temperatures is melting the permafrost, releasing a lot of gases that have been trapped in the permafrost for the millennia. And with the heat comes the mosquitoes, and even finding a campsite along the Noatak River became problematic because there was so much silt in the water that they had a hard time finding drinking water. So to make that a little more real for us, I have just pulled together some of my favorite memories of floating down a number of the rivers in the Brooks Range out onto the Arctic Plain. And many years I worked up there floating various rivers out of the Brooks Range to the north. And the idea was to create books and calls for action to fight the proposed development of oil in the last 4% of the wild coastline of Alaska. That's pretty dramatic. So here's a shot looking over the Shingdakot River in the Brooks Range, and it's typical of the way these rivers are. They're braided rivers, they meander, and as you raft down these rivers, you have to make sure that you pick the right channel, otherwise you're dragging your rafts over the sandbars. So this is very typical looking back into the Brooks Range, and one thing you noticed is the ground is brown. Even in the late spring, the ground is still frozen landscapes. There's a lot of residual snow patches. And at least at one time in our history, it was true. There happens to be a little rock ptarmigan in the foreground. So yeah, I've done this a number of times in a number of rivers. And it's the only way to go as far as I'm concerned, because you can bring all your camera gear, food, and raft. You tend to raft one day and walk the next. And, you know, the scenery is never boring. And occasionally you run into herds of caribou crossing the river right in front of you, or a grizzly bear on the bank. And it is a great exposure to truly wild country. And I'm happy to say that still the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is still unencumbered with a bunch of oil derricks and roads. But who knows what the future lies. And you can see in this image very tiny rafts and dome tents, just to give you a sense of scale. But this is a changing landscape. What is barren along the river, as you see, with just a few willows, more and more willows are coming in and actually drawing other animals into this environment. So it's a landscape under change and rapid change to boot. So I look back with fond memories on this collective of photos in the high Arctic, and it's prophetic that many of the trips I did was encompassing June 21st, the longest day of the year, where the sun never set. So it's a great experience to go through that as well. And what you're looking at in this image is off ice, and off ice builds up over Arctic rivers during the winter months. Every subsequent freeze adds a layer above the river. And by late spring and early summer, the ice is kind of relegated to the margins of the river. And this is a place where it's great to photograph, but it is also a place where caribou, especially the porcupine caribou herd that live in the Brooks Range, seek out the cooling temperatures of this off ice, because it not only cools their bodies on very hot days, but it also limits the amount of flies that are out there on the colder environment. And it's interesting that this aerial shot from a fixed wing aircraft also makes these caribou almost look like the insects that they're trying to avoid. But what will happen now, as the ice doesn't hang on until the late spring, is that these caribou will even move further and more consistently, because they're always trying to get away from the mosquitoes and the warble flies. And often they're up on ridges where the wind is blowing, or down on these ice patches. But that will change as the ice melts away, and it will. Nothing stays the same. So you can just see how these caribou are built to walk. There's a clicking in their feet, and the clicking represents a different joint in their feet, attachment to their legs, very different from elk and deer and moose. So these animals are built to migrate, and the porcupine caribou herd has the longest migratory route of any terrestrial animal on the planet. That says a lot. And along the way, they have to negotiate a lot of these rivers, and it's just an extraordinary sight to see some 160,000 caribou on the move. But this now is the very landscape that is melting and becoming soupy and muddy and sloggy, and it's much more difficult to traverse this open landscape.
Got a question from Facebook just asking when these photos were taken. Is it from?
It's a great question. And this particular image was shot for a book called Alakshak that came out in the early 90s. And so it was the late 80s, early 90s that I was doing a lot of work up there. But then I also followed up all through the 90s, and even did a story on Travels the Edge on floating the Arctic. But as I say, the Arctic is changing. Beavers are coming in, damming small creeks, creating water, pools for other animals, including the moose and the willows that grow around the newfound pools. So the moose are coming in ever increasing numbers. The Arctic hares, the snowshoe rabbits are coming in because the willows are now growing in mini forests in the Arctic. And with the rabbits come the lynx. So animals are changing, adapting to this new environment. And just as I look back, these great moments in the high Arctic, 24 hours of daylight floating down, it's great memories. And now you're looking from a mountain on the very northern edge of the Brooks Range out to the famous Arctic Plain and beyond. You can even see the Arctic Ocean, and beyond that, the ice flow. And that ice is receding further and further until it'll be no more in the years to come. And then animals will adapt. Polar bears will be land terrestrial. They'll be terrestrial carnivores, and they already are breeding with Alaskan brown bears. So the population of polar bears is going to change. And again, along the Arctic plain, there's all these little lakes created by chunks of ice as glaciers receded. And this provides homes to loons and other seabirds, including sandhill cranes, whooper swans, trumpeter swans, and so forth. All right, so that's the little 5-minute homage to a recent article. Let me, I have not practiced this too much. So what you're about to see is a little video taken here in West Seattle, but also down in Mendocino. So it'll be pretty self-explanatory, and then I'll take it over from there.
In a couple of weeks, I'm teaching a workshop down in Mendocino on the North California coast. And like every workshop I teach, I try to add something new, a new challenge for the participants. I'm here in Lincoln Park, and I'm going to take a shot of these trees, but in a very different way than I've done in the past. I'm going to take exaggeratedly long exposure of about 4 seconds. And in the first part of the exposure, I'm going to hold the camera as still as I can, then move it. And the translation then becomes something analogous to a impressionist painting. And that is what I'm always trying to achieve, is something that looks a little different than just a straight photograph. I should also say that the jade green lichen on these trees are what's going to be amazing about it. Because right now, a straight shot is kind of not noticeable, but in a long moving shot, it becomes much more pronounced. And then I move the camera up and down during the course of this exposure. And that's the technique, something that looks really different. And then I often will look at my results. And if I need to make an adjustment, I'll do that at this point. It needs a little more light.
What are you shooting, Art?
I'm just shooting the panoramic. This is a really foggy, misty day along the North California coast. And so with a 10-stop neutral density filter and a polarizer, I'm going to get probably about a 10-second exposure. And so with these really clearly delineated rocks against the blur of the long exposure, it should turn the image into something a little more unexpected, a little more artistic.
How are you doing, everybody? I'm getting basically like a 10-second exposure. I've got a 10-stop and a polarizer. Pretty nice. Timer on. I'm really curious about those trees up there, though. They look like a nice group without a lot of small bushes around them. We're acting like kids throwing rocks in ponds, but there's a great effect. The ripples in this pond are created by the reflections of the trees across the way, and magic happens. So everybody ready? Here we go. And eventually these ripples come together in an unpredictable and beautiful abstract way. And the trick is not just getting a sharp shot of a reflection. You've got to show context, like something on the surface or a branch in the foreground, so that if you invert the image, you challenge the viewer of your photo of what they're looking at. Trying to get an interesting shot inside this old burned out redwood that's still alive. And so I'm up under it. I'm going to take 2 exposures, one for the outside. So first shot, got the tree. Now I'm going to open it up and try to get the detail inside. It's amazing. It's just a few layers of bark
Otherwise, this tree is totally hollow, and yet the tree is absolutely thriving. These are tough old trees. So I must admit that that location of Mendocino was the first time we had been there, and it's a treasure trove of great locations, but also great restaurants, beautiful little cabins to stay at. We were down there a couple of weeks ago in December. So it's a great place in December. The colors are muted. And I was down there, as I said earlier, to try to push my participants into further directions. In other words, many of the people in that workshop had taken multiple workshops this particular year. In fact, I feel like I spent the year with all of them. So here we're looking at Impressionist paintings by Claude Monet and Renoir and other artists in the Impressionist period of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. But there's not a lot of sharp detail in these paintings. And so what a great place to start to play with perceptions. Like now you're looking through a piece of plastic that was overhanging this rural scene, actually in Romania a couple of years ago, but it reminded me of something that I was after. You know, there's enough sharp lines within this image that the eye can focus on, and then the rest of the wildly blended colors can sit quietly behind. But in a straight shot in nature, this is what you get. This is a shot of a grove of aspen trees. But during the course of that the second exposure, I started off with a holding the camera still, and then I moved it. And this is the desired effect, because you see sharp lines and blurred motion, and that translates an image and an environment into something much more painterly and reminiscent of what the Impressionist period was trying to achieve with their paintings. So I'm very happy with the direction that this is taking me, because I've not done motion quite as dramatically as this. I did a book called Rhythms from the Wild. Everywhere water was flowing and snow was blowing and fish were swimming and all those things. But now is going into yet a deeper realm of Impressionist paintings. So down in Lincoln Park, I would walk through on one day and start to take these longer exposures. And I had no idea whether they would turn out nice or like a mistake. But the ones that looked good were the ones where I started off with a very still camera. And then during the course of a 3, 4, 5, and even 10-second exposure, I started to move it. And that combination of blurred motion and sharp focus is what I was after. So I love these shots, and this is a very rudimentary, average location in a park 1 mile or a half a mile from where I live. But as you can see, it translates the subject into something that I can't actually predict. I can only hope. And here's a Corot painting, again, from that era of Impressionism. And again, very few sharp lines within that painting. And so in a blurred motion shot like this, you see the sharp lines and branches, but then there's ghost images and motion. And that is what I'm trying to emulate when I'm doing these. Here's a classic Claude Monet painting, and here's a moving shot of the madrona trees where I'm twisting the camera directly above me in a very fast shutter speed. This is only 1/13 of a second, not 13 seconds, but 1/13. So I'm just moving the camera as fast as I can. And I'm coming away with images that I would not shot in those 40 years before. So I like this direction. It's just one more thing to teach and to grow as a photographer. Some people would just say, oh, it's all bullshit. Yeah, it doesn't look good to me. But I'm after something that looks different than the landscapes I've shot in the past. And many of these start to really take on much more of a painterly effect, like a rich oil painting, as far as I'm concerned. And again, looking back at that jade green on some of those trees I photographed earlier. And if I looked at this and somebody else had shot it, I would say unequivocally it's a pastel drawing. So I am happy with this. And back down to Mendocino and in those redwoods, you can see in the center of this photo, there's little areas where the light is catching the ferns. And I just zoomed in on that and started playing with twisting the camera. And what I came away with was something that looks like the Christmas lights outside my window in my own garden right now. So I love that blurred motion, abstraction, and yet in that first part of the exposure, the ferns are clearly distinguished. And this is really getting wild now. It helps if you're drinking tequila when you're in the forest. I'm just kidding. I was intentional. So here we're in Montgomery Redwood State Preserve. It's very close to Mendocino, but it's beautiful. These old trees, you saw that earlier one that was burned out from within. And in this forest we go, and yeah, we shoot it this way, more traditional, trying to take clean shots, and then again, moving the camera and learning from the experience. I love this one, looking through the redwoods at trees that are better lit, but it creates something very different than what I've shot before. And the whole idea, the entire idea of this endeavor is to keep pushing myself into directions I've not gone before. It keeps me getting out of bed in the morning. I'm happy to teach it. Once I learn it, I teach it. And here's a double exposure of alder trees covered in lichen. And it almost becomes like a Bev Doolittle painting. It also looks like an Escher-esque confused image. And I just love the textures. And yet there are sharp enough edges to these trunks to rest the eye. But the water is what I was really after in these images. And I'm closing with a series of shots where the camera is still, the subject is moving, like these wind-driven leaves that were floating on a pond that in about a 2 or 3 second exposure, 25 second, according to my notes, they're just drifting through the frame. And I love that abstraction. And here down in Mendocino, again, leaves floating and drifting, and your eye goes to the trunks of the trees, and then you discover these leaves, and you have to kind of figure out what you're looking at. And here again is a tight shot of the disrupted water as created by my own rock that I hucked into the pond, but you can see how beautiful the lines, the abstraction is. So the more I do this and I start to look, I talk often in my class about metaphors, where we're looking at the beautiful longer exposures of reflections of leaves in the water. And the more you start to shoot it, the more it reveals itself. So I'm asking my participants to really stay on a little area within a creek and give it some time. And then you start to discover things you wouldn't have noticed in the first couple of minutes. And the longer exposures, like this is a several second exposure, you can see how there are sharp lines, but blurred motion as well. So I love photographing the water in a very different way. And these are very small areas in the creek surface, but water's welling up and creating these little circles and boils and star-shaped lines. And this is where I'm really happy the most, where I'm starting to understand what I'm photographing. And it generally occurs after I've given it 5 or 10 minutes. And then you start to see faces, like I'm looking at a cat face in the middle of this. And these would become metaphors. And yet there's another face in the lower portion of this frame. And these aren't high art, but it's creative. It keeps your brain occupied and it keeps your brain tuned in to what you're seeing, and you can make minor adjustments. And I think it's all good. If you have a rich imagination, if you start to see a lizard-like shape in this image, you start to gain the perspective of the metaphor. And I do see like a lizard head in the lower left portion with kind of a strange eye. Here I look at a primate of Southeast Asia, a slender loris with big eyes, tiny nose, kind of a smile on his face, and it's looking straight at us with big watery eyes. So these metaphors are great because it just, triggers your imagination. And if you start to see faces within what you're shooting, I think you're well on your way to really opening up your imagination. So in all these shots, I see funny little faces. And it's just a continuation of what I was doing when we were photographing in degraded environments, in old cement bunkers. Now we're in nature and finding the same. And here's this provocative eye that I'll close with, but not before I actually cloned it and tried to make it and see what it would look like. So yeah, now you're looking at the old man of the creek. So that's what I wanted to show you this morning or this afternoon, that you can be much more creative. Even if you've gone to the same place multiple times, go back and shoot with different styles and with different energy. And I walked through Lincoln Park a couple of weeks ago. There were still some leaves on the ground. And I love the whole process because I didn't have a tripod. I was hand holding the camera the whole time. People were walking by me as if I was crazy. And yet I was getting some shots that I really, really loved. So Kyle, we're almost out of time here, but are there any questions?
We're almost out of time. Not a ton of questions, but just a ton of compliments on how beautiful the images are. Lots of happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
That's nice. That's really good.
A lot of people too, sounds like they're kind of inspired and might want to head out and try some of these techniques.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that's cool.
now the days are getting longer. Get out there with your camera on a nice day and get into the forest, and don't wait for the sun. Just get out there wherever you are. You know, getting through all this COVID business is made easier when you're out creating. You know, you don't have to be around a whole lot of people. So keep your mind occupied, creating, happy. I'm on my way to Mexico in 2 days. I'm going down to Oaxaca. As many people are aware, I'm photographing a book called Act of Faith, and I want to get down into the First Nations of Oaxaca, Mexico, and see how they celebrate Christmas. So I'm on my way. And more than likely, the video that I shoot down there, you will see at the end of January. We haven't posted the date, but it will be the last Tuesday in January. Until then, wait, we got a couple more minutes. Ask me a question.
Let's see. You know, I saw a couple questions, but some of those I'm gonna have to answer offline because they're like about printing techniques.
Oh, okay. Printing techniques.
Going back to the photos you shot of the Arctic, there was a question I saw. Just wondering about how this climate change is going to affect the migrations of those animals that are there.
Well, I think that nesting, or what typically happens with the porcupine caribou herd, they migrate in a clockwise motion. I believe it's clockwise all through the Brooks Range on the south side, and then they cross over and into the north side where the Arctic Plain is, and it's just this big circle of migratory animals. They're tough animals. They will persevere because that's all they know to do. But I would imagine the numbers are going to drop because mosquitoes have been able to drain a calf of its blood to the degree the calf dies. And if the temperatures are rising, mosquitoes are going to flourish, and these guys will struggle even more. So it's just the way it is. You know, there's no great news happening up in the Arctic regarding climate change. There's other areas around the planet where bird populations are exploding because temperatures in the oceans are rising. Certainly, you can look at the Eastern Pacific humpback whale population. I've said this before. We've gone from 1,600 to 26,000. So there are populations of animals that are doing pretty well in today's world, but up in the Arctic, it's probably the polar bear's last dance, as they will evolve out of being polar bears. And then during the next ice age, they will reemerge. This is likely to occur. That's my 2 cents anyways.
Got just one more question
Yeah.
here about how much post-editing is involved in the abstracts that you shoot.
You know, in post-editing, what I do is I take the highlights to the left, open up the shadows, play with lights and darks. And for the most part, that's it. If it's the landscape, I may drop in an ND filter over the sky to darken it so that if there's detail in the clouds, I want to bring that further out. But the very fact of closing down the highlights, opening up the shadows, playing with lights and darks, it actually brings contrast to the image. And that has a tendency to saturate the image, as it should be, because in that saturation, it will look much more akin to the image you shot. And I've said this again before, a raw image is how we shoot for the most part. And that raw image is pretty flat. It was designed to be flat so you can maximize the lights and darks to get it back to where it needs to be. All right. Okay. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Get to your dinner or your football game or whatever you're watching, and we'll see you in next month. All right.